Nothing on the Bonnell Foundation's Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast should be considered medical advice. Medical advice can only come from your CF physician. Cystic fibrosis can be a devastating diagnosis, but living with the disease can bring positivity and a new appreciation for each day. From the Bonnell Foundation in Detroit, Michigan, it's the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast, sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical. Here's your host, Laura Bonnell.
Dr. Quinton, who is 76 years old now, is a humble man who changed the face of cystic fibrosis. Thanks to CFRI in California for sharing with the Bonnell Foundation all the wonderful contributions that Dr. Quinton has made. I'm reading a portion from their bio tribute to him. Dr. Quinton discovered and designed the defect in cystic fibrosis that prevents chloride ions, part of salt, from crossing cells. He used small pieces of isolated human sweat glands to define the defect. Dr. Quinton's work explained why the sweat from patients with CF is abnormally salty, and this was a huge finding. This knowledge has shed so much light on cystic fibrosis. Correcting the defect was the basis for screening drugs to correct dysfunctions and CF mutations. And on top of all he has done, Dr. Quinton is also an author. He wrote less than 1,000 collected thoughts, insights, ideas, and observations, and a little book of wannabe poems, along with too many to mention articles in health journals. And I wasn't trying to bury the lead here, but it's so important to know that we're not defined by our disease. Dr. Quinton does also have cystic fibrosis. We joined him via Zoom outside of his California home, and every once in a while you may hear the sounds of a mariachi band in the distance as his gardener works. First of all, Dr. Paul Quinton, I just wanted to start by saying I'm so glad that Siri Vaith introduced us, that she gave me your name initially to be in our Portraits of Cystic Fibrosis calendar, and we featured you. And then I met you in person at the CFRI event and just fell in love with you there.
Oh, my God.
No, you are a fabulous human, a wonderful and such an important contributor to the CF community. I could never thank you enough.
That Siri is always getting me in trouble.
Yes, she is. She's wonderful. So, yeah, she knows good people. We know good people. That is for sure. So thank you for that, for always being willing to talk about what you do and the importance of things in the CF world. And as I said in the intro, you yourself have cystic fibrosis. And if you don't mind saying your age, can you tell us how old you are and then what the world was like when you were diagnosed and how you were diagnosed and what your life expectancy was at that time?
I'm 76, going on 77. And the one thing I found about getting old that's a benefit is you get to have the COVID virus shot first.
Thank goodness for that.
I have now been vaccinated, so I'm immortal.
Fantastic.
In the last several years, we've had these drugs that have become available to us, and they have made an enormous difference in our health and in controlling this, cystic fibrosis, this disease. Well, I was born in 1944, and that was just a little while after Dorothy Anderson had introduced cystic fibrosis to the medical literature. So sometimes I like to say that I and cystic fibrosis have been here about the same length of time. I didn't know that I had cystic fibrosis, though, until I was 19. And, growing up as a child, I always had a cough, and I raised sputum, and so I learned how to spit very well when I was a kid. And as gross as that may sound, but...
Not gross to a CF mom. We're completely used to that.
To make the best of what you got. So,
absolutely.
You have to have a spitting contest. So anyway, I didn't have too much trouble until I got to be a teenager. And then I started hemorrhaging, with hemoptysis. And, the first time you have that, it kind of raises the hair on the back of your neck and kind of alarmed my parents. But it wasn't much. I just cough up a little bit, but still it's blood. So I lived with that for several years. And but finally, when I was about 16, I had a really major hemoptysis. for that, I went in to see my pulmonologist, and he decided that, well, we had to do a surgery to take out the upper lobe of the right lung because that's where all the bleeding was coming from. So I had a pneumonectomy, a lobectomy, and when I was 16.
You still weren't diagnosed. They were treating the symptoms, but not the disease, right?
Yeah. So basically, if I go back a little bit, my mother, when I was about a year and a half or a little younger, I guess, she took me to my pediatrician, and she was complaining that, this baby coughs all the time. And, he kind of he said, well, I don't think there's much we can do about that. He's got chronic bronchitis, and he's just going to have to learn to live with it.
Wow.
That's what we did. We learned to live with it, and we lived with it until, finally this hemoptysis thing came up, and I had the lung surgery, and I still didn't know that I had CF. I went off to college in my freshman year, and I was 19, I guess, 18 or 19. I think it was sophomore. No, I guess it was my freshman year. Yeah, there we go. Too many years ago. That's half a century ago, damn.
Yeah, you are way above the average life expectancy, so we're grateful. So continue though.
So anyway, I, as things happen in college, I kind of got sweet on a young lady, and I started thinking about marriage and all that sort of thing. And so I decided, well, maybe I better find out what this chronic bronchitis bronchiectasis is. So I went to the library, to the research library at the University of Texas there in Austin, and started looking up chronic bronchitis and bronchiectasis. And so I was flipping through the pages. There was an asterisk. It referred me to a footnote at the bottom of the page. It says, see with respect to cystic fibrosis. And so I don't know what cystic fibrosis was. So I looked up cystic fibrosis and started reading the symptoms of it. And I thought, holy cow, this is me. Jesus. So I went back and I went home and I told my folks, and it didn't mean much to them. I mean, nobody had heard of cystic fibrosis. So I went back to my pulmonologist and I said, I did this research and looking up on bronchiectasis, and I found that, this disease called cystic fibrosis sounds just like what I have. And he was dead serious. He looked around, he said, you don't have cystic fibrosis. He said, if you had cystic fibrosis, you'd be dead by now, for one thing. And if you weren't dead, you would have a lot more trouble staying alive than you do. I said, well, yeah, but look at this, pains in the chest, the upper lobes are affected, I have some stomach pains, and I sweat very salty sweat. I've known that for years. That's always just been my sweat. Paul's sweat's got salt in it. It's kind of funny. Why does it do that? But, it just messes up his shirts when they dry. And my mother didn't like that, the salt stains. So, but anyway, it was just, that's what Paul does. I don't know about this. I don't know how you explain this salty sweat. It's pretty, and the upper lobes being involved and all this sort of thing. He said, well, okay. I know this guy who works in cystic fibrosis, and he's across the street over there at Texas Institute of Rehabilitation and Research. And so I'll set you up and you go over and talk to him and see what he says. Okay, well, that guy happened to be Gunyon Harrison. And Gunyon Harrison is one of the old frontiers in CF. I mean, he goes back to the days of Swachman and those days. And he started as a resident training with polio. And he was there working with people that couldn't breathe with iron lungs. And, that sort of got settled down. And then this lady came I can't remember her name, but anyway, she came to where he was there. And she asked the attending, he was head of the unit, and she asked him if there was anything he could do with this disease that her son had. And he said, no, I don't think so. But Gunyon overheard him say that, and he got in on the conversation, and he was intrigued. So that sort of changed his life. He became a CF doc, and he opened up the first cystic fibrosis center in the Southwest, one of the first in the country, actually, I think. So anyway, I saw Gunyon was my physician until, he was my physician basically all of his life. He died last November. He was the one that inspired me to go into research. And actually, I don't know if he inspired or instructed, but
wow,
he was trained at the Virginia Military Academy, so he had kind of this presence about him. When I went to undergraduate, I decided that I said I want to be Dr. Zhivago. because that way I could do poetry and literature and do medicine also. And I was going to be so I was going to medical school. And so I applied around the medical school, and my first admission was the University of Texas in Galveston. And I was jumping up and down, and, I was very happy and elated I got in. And I went tootling over to Dr. Harrison's office, and I burst in and said, Dr. Harrison, I got into medical school. I'm in medical school. And he got up and he kind of looked at me weird. And he came over and stood right in front of me, and he started poking me in the chest and saying, you don't want to go to medical school. You don't want to go to medical school. You're crazy. If you go to medical school, they're going to put you in one of those little clinics in an ER or something, and you're going to catch a bug and you're going to die. You don't want to go to medical school. You want to be a scientist. You get your stuff together and you go over there across the street to Rice University, and you see this guy I know, his name is Bill Philpott, and you see if you can become a scientist. So I went over to see Bill Philpott, and at that time, things were much different than they are now in the early 60s, because the whole country was bent on science. We had Sputnik, and the Russians were beating us. And so I was able to get a scholarship from the NIH to pay for my graduate education fully. So instead of it costing me at that time, it would cost me $10,000 a year to go to medical school. They were paying me about $6,000 or $7,000 a year to get through graduate school, which was in those days that would carry you. And so that's what I did. I said, well, I'll get my PhD, and then after that, I'll go to medical school. And but I never wound up going to medical school. I got my PhD, and then I went out to Los Angeles to do a postdoc, and spent a couple of years there. And then I went on to the faculty at UCLA for a while, and then I went to UC Riverside, and I got tenure there. And so things were going pretty well until I got to be about 50.
Did you ever get what your life expectancy was?
Well, what I should say is that when I went to see Gunyon Harrison that first time to see about cystic fibrosis, so when I went into his clinic, he assigned me to the nurse, and they came in and they did a sweat test. And then they came in and they did another sweat test. And another half an hour later, they came in and did another sweat test. And then after a little while, Dr. Harrison came, and he walked through the door and he said, well, it looks like you got it.
Wow.
And I said, well, Dr. Harrison, how long am I going to live? Because at that time, the life expectancy was about 7 or 8, maybe 9 years from what we knew of people who had it. And he looked at me and he said, well, hell, I don't know.
That's so scary, though. I mean, you're in the prime of your life and you're hearing this news. That's terrifying as a college student.
I don't know. I guess it was a little scary, but I didn't find it terrifying. I just thought that, well, I got to do a lot of living quick here because it's going to be over pretty soon. So.
Gotcha. And then fast forward to when you were 50 and all hell broke loose.
So now I'm on the faculty at UC Riverside, and I have another major hemoptysis. So they admitted me to Stanford, and after a little while, they decided that they better take out the other upper left lobe, which is where I was bleeding from now. And so they took that out, and so I recovered from that. And I was living out in Riverside, which is one of the smoggy areas of Southern California. And that was, that second episode was kind of a warning light that said, you better get out of here and get some cleaner air to breathe, because this isn't going to do you any good. And so I asked the university if I could make an intra-university transfer. And fortunately, UC agreed that if you have a reason to transfer from one university to the other, and if you can continue to do the work you're doing, then they will allow a transfer. And so I put out some feelers to the coastal universities, Orange County and San Diego, and they both were interested. And I was going to go to Orange County, but they weren't going to offer me very much. And then when the chairman of pediatrics at San Diego heard about it, he gave me a call saying, you got to come down here. We got a place for you. So I went to San Diego, and I'm glad I did. That was a good move. They really treated me wonderfully, and they gave me a lab, and set me up and everything. And, it was just a really good place to work. And they had a CF clinic, and the doctors there, I knew Mike Light became my physician. And then Ivan Harwood, and, it's been a few years in the process.
And that's worked out really well for us as well. You did some great work.
Well, it certainly worked out well for me, yes. And so that's where we went. And I just retired from UC, going on 4 years now. I retired when I was 72, a little past that. So I haven't been nearly as active. My lab is still there, and I have a couple of people that are still doing a few things, but it may come up a little bit because I was talking to my assistant, or my associate, I shouldn't say assistant, last night, and he's going to apply for a couple more grants. And if he gets those, then I'm sure it will go on for some time further. But I am not nearly as active as I used to be, and I don't know, sitting on my laurels. Although you can't sit on your laurels because they got thorns in them.
And I think you're still very involved with all of us, thankfully. And I wonder, what are your feelings in the midst of this pandemic, having cystic fibrosis, knowing all you know? Do you feel like either that the rest of the country may understand?
From the COVID, from what the effect of COVID? Well, as far as I can tell, I've been following it a little bit, but I'm not really sure that I'm completely on top of it. But from what I have heard and feedback from the registry at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, cystic fibrosis patients have not suffered or been infected any more than people in the normal population. And in fact, it looks like there may be a little bit less. One possibility is that, well, we run around with infections all the time, so our immune system is already, kind of primed, and maybe it just resists or knocks out the virus more readily. But I think the more practical response to that is that we're very much more accustomed to taking care of ourselves. I mean, we don't run around giving each other kisses and hugs. And, for me, for years now, I've been bumping elbows instead of shaking hands. And, most people, I think, with CF do that. They don't shake hands, and they don't get right in your face when they talk. And if you get too close, they back up. And so we've been, now I can say it's kind of interesting because everybody got cystic fibrosis. So everybody has to protect themselves
Right.
and back up a little bit. So I think, that's probably the reason that we haven't had big hits in CF that are much higher frequency than in normal. But, I don't know, but it hasn't been devastating to the CF community, thank God. And, there are a few people who have had it, and there are a couple of reports from England and European common market. So I don't know what the exact figures are, but it's just, the main thing is that we haven't suffered much more than, or as much as we might have anticipated. You might have anticipated that people with CF would be dying like flies, but we're not.
What is the future that you see for cystic fibrosis?
Well, I think there's every reason to be optimistic, and if for no other reason, because of the success that we've had in the last 8 to 10 years. I mean, the drugs that have come out have been absolutely phenomenal. I think we can be very thankful for that. I have to quickly add that somebody needs to do something about the cost of these drugs, because they're denying too many people with cystic fibrosis from a salvation, really. And, you take people that are in underdeveloped countries around the world, and there's no way that they're going to be able to afford these drugs. And so we're very lucky here in the States in a way, because most of us have insurance. And when you get to be as old as I am, then there's Medicare, and they pretty much take care of it. But, $250,000, $300,000 a year to stay alive, people can't do that. So anyway, that's my sermon for the moment. But the drugs are wonderful. They do great things. And the problem is that they don't get everybody. I mean, we have so many mutations in cystic fibrosis. I think now the count is up to about 2,000. Fortunately, most of those involve the delta F508 and a few other a little less common but approachable or amenable mutations that respond to these drugs. But I think that as molecular biology goes on, And I'm extremely impressed with what the people are learning to do with CRISPR and gene editing. And, I don't know how long it's going to be, but I really expect that someone is going to start the CRISPR stuff and the gene editing and be able to correct the genes of cystic fibrosis. And I think they may very well get to the point where they can treat the disease in vivo. That is, they can design carriers that will insert into stem cells in the airways and correct the gene. And therefore, you just go on your happy way. You don't need medicines.
Can you explain how gene editing works? It's wonderful to watch an animated clip of how it's done, but if you could explain it, that would be great.
The concept is that our genes are put together on a long thread of nucleotides, a chain, and changes to the nucleotides in that string of nucleotides are what cause the mutations. And so if we have a delta F508 mutation, it's been deleted. It's 508, delta 508 at the 508 position has been deleted. So if you can put that nucleotide back in there, and what they do with the CRISPR is they chop off or get it to match that part of the DNA, and they chop it out and replace it with a piece of DNA that has the correct sequence. And then things go merrily on if it's done properly. So, and that can be done, and that's been done in vitro with tissue culture. The trick is to take that technique and put it inside, say, my lungs, for example, get the molecules that to carry the corrected gene slice or spice and have it inserted at the correct position in a cell that's going to reproduce. So you can't just do it to cells that are on the surface because they've already matured and they are doomed to slough off. But if you can get to what we call the stem cells, which are the cells that generate the rest of the epithelium, say in the lung, then if you can get it into those cells, then every time they divide, they will have the correct gene and they will produce cells that are already corrected. So that's the ultimate cure, at least as I can see it. But that's still a ways off. It's not an easy thing to do this, and especially in vivo with live human beings. So that'll take some clinical trials and probably some brave people to volunteer for the trials to see if they can get it to work. But that's where we got to go. And I think we'll get there. I don't know how long, how many years, or I don't think it's going to be next month, but I see it on the horizon. Yeah.
It is truly a miracle and offers so much hope.
Oh, it's wonderful. I mean, it really, we can now improve things for 80 to 90% of CF patients. And, for example, I have the Sirius gene, the delta F508, and then the other gene, which is the R117H, which is a substitution. And that one has still some residual function. And in fact, there is residual function in the delta F508 gene. So the problem with that one is that the protein has trouble getting to the membrane. So we have these drugs now that do two things. They correct and then they potentiate. So the drugs that correct are those that help the protein, once it's synthesized and produced in the cell, it helps it get to the membrane where it's supposed to be to function. So otherwise, it's recognized as a mutation and it's tagged so that the cell automatically kicks it out, so you don't get much of it to the membrane. And then once it's there, if you have a drug that will make it work better, potentiate it, then you can turn it on so that it gives you enough function that it fixes things. So we have a class, or we have a compound of, or a group of drugs. That's a trilogy because it's got 3 drugs all combined, and you take those and take a couple of pills a day every day and a little promoter, and things get a lot better. They really do. And I hardly cough at all now. I do, and I raise a little bit of sputum, but not much. And so it's been an incredible relief to have this new change in lifestyle.
You're very passionate about drug pricing.
Well, it's easy to sit here and speculate. A lot easier to do that than it is to get it to happen. I try to protest it as much as I'm allowed to, I guess. And I think that's an important thing, that people with cystic fibrosis have to raise the consciousness of others that this is not a just thing to do, that we can't make profit on the basis of extortion. And at $300,000 a year, I don't see how you can say that that's anything but extortion. So how do you fix that? Well, I would like to see the company that produces the drug have a kind of a change of heart and make sure that the drug is available through compassionate use to anyone that needs the drug. And in fact, when these drugs first came out, I met with the CEO at one of the cystic fibrosis conferences and talked to him. And, I was complaining about the cost of the drug then. And, I still resent the fact that he assured me that no one who needed the drug would be denied the drug, that anyone who needed the drug would be able to get the drug. And that didn't come true. That didn't come true. And it's still not true. There's still that price is there. And they have developed, I think, a better compassionate use policy than they previously had, because they have one now. But it really needs to be expanded. And so, well, what will happen? I mean, I don't know whether they will change things on their own or whether they may be forced into it by competition. And I think this reflects back onto what happened with HIV and the AIDS thing when the drugs came out to control HIV. They were extremely expensive also. But then somebody recognized that they could produce the drug for just a few dollars. And when that happened, the price came down. So it became very affordable. So I think we should look for something like that. And, the problem is that patents are supposed to only be good for a certain number of years. But we've got such good lawyers now that they keep figuring out ways to extend them. And so I don't know how long the price is going to be controlled by law or behind the law. But I would hope that would come to the end. But there are other companies. I think there's one in Argentina that is producing drugs that are very similar to the drugs that we are taking with these costs. So as they become available, that will be a good incentive for people who want to sell the expensive drugs to bring their price down so they can. The price is still expensive. I mean, I think it runs about $20,000 now for the duplicating drug. I think that's what has to be done in one way or another. Now, maybe you could get legislation to control the cost of drugs, to put some restrictions on what drug companies can charge for these drugs and make it more acceptable. In the meantime, somebody will have made a lot of money, a lot.
And let's talk about mental health in CF. What are your thoughts on that?
Honestly, I haven't given that a lot of thought. I know that it's a significant problem with people with any kind of terminal diagnosis. And I think that there are people in psychiatry and in psychotherapy that can help a lot. We have, we have someone here at UCSD that has been very, very helpful. Unfortunately, with the COVID crisis, they are completely overwhelmed. I mean, everybody has a problem now that they need some help with all the challenges of the COVID epidemic and people being locked in and not being able to socialize. And, I think we probably have more mental health problems because of COVID than we do because of cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis, we have kind of a community, we're united by a common theme or stream. And, we keep our distance. And, I am one of those rebels that has protested the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation's policy of keeping us out of their meetings. And so, we can't, we're not supposed to attend the meetings of Cystic Fibrosis Foundation because we might pick up a bug or something from somebody else. And, that wouldn't be very good, which is true. But I don't think that the CF Foundation or any other organization has the right to take away my agency. We are adults and we have our own agency, and we should be able to decide if we're willing to take the risk. And, the CFRI here in California does a very good job with this. And, I go to all of their meetings. And any other number of CF patients do also, but they have it set up so that people stay at distance. They have the munchies and the drinks and things set up so that people don't cross-contaminate, and it's done. And I don't think that we've had any note of anyone attending those meetings that was contaminated by or contaminated someone else. And, in that regard, I think there's as much of a problem with normal people as there is with CF people, because when these docs go to the meetings, they go to the CF meetings, they're all there and they've all associated with CF patients, and they go and they shake each other's hands and give each other hugs. And, who knows what bugs they're passing around among themselves. So, I think a slight amount of hypocrisy here that maybe should be evaluated a little bit. But, I'm probably getting too much on the fringe now of my iconicalism, or my being too much of a curmudgeon.
Well, you're not too much of a curmudgeon. This is great feedback into the CF community, who tend not to get near other people with CF, and it's very isolating for them. So this is a bit eye-opening.
Yeah, well, I would like to be as involved as, I won't say as much as I can, because I always feel like I should or could do more. But, for participating in something like this, I enjoy that. And if I can be of service or help, very happy to do it. I like to continue going to the meetings at CFRI and talking with people and, doing what I can. I'm going to give another little talk in September, I guess, at the national meetings. But I'm not, really active in the lab and doing active research now. One of my associates, as I said, is still trying to continue that. But, one of the unfortunate things is that this COVID thing just really kind of shut us down, because, the whole medical center just went boom, nothing. And, I've been back to the lab of it now 4, 5, 6 times over the last year. And every time I go back, it's a ghost town. Nobody's there. So we're supposed to be shut up and closed in. We can't do research, at least the kind of research we do, under those conditions. And, most of our research has been dealing with patients and volunteers with tissue from donors. So we take skin biopsies and work on the sweat glands from that. And, so that makes us a little bit unique, that, we're not doing other things that don't really involve the live patient and, taking natural tissues. But, I'm getting older. And as you get older, you don't get smarter. All this stuff about becoming wise and wisdom, that's a bunch of, what you get is a shorter memory. And, you start looking around for words. And what was that? What we used to go? Who was that I talked to this morning?
Take us back to the time when you made your historic discovery about chloride ions.
That involves physiology, electrophysiology. And so how can I explain that? We were working with sweat ducts and sweat glands, and I decided very early on that we had to work with the native tissue, that we weren't going to get there by just working on cell cultures. But at that time, very few people were working with on cystic fibrosis. This was 83. And we had a cystic fibrosis community. We had the CF club, and they met annually. But they were mostly clinicians. But anyway, I decided that, look, if we're going to do this, we got to study the tissue in the patient. Then it was just a problem of kind of weeding it out, and decided, okay, what are we going to work on? Well, it was kind of obvious that we had to work on the sweat gland, at least to me it was, because it's very difficult to get a piece of lung or a piece of pancreas or other tissues that are involved, because that involved major surgery. And then beyond that, even if you got the tissue, most of those tissues were so messed up pathologically from the infections and the mucus clogging and blocking and such, that it changed everything. It made it very, very difficult, to basically impossible, to make it behave properly. So it was kind of obvious that the sweat gland had to be the candidate, because it doesn't produce much mucus, and it doesn't get clogged up, and it doesn't destroy itself. So if you get it, you've got a nice piece of tissue that clearly expresses the defect, but it's not a raging mess. So the issue then became, okay, how do you get it? And so I went for several years just learning how to take sweat glands out of pieces of skin and keep them. They're a long tubule. A sweat gland is just a long tubule like a piece of spaghetti. And it has two halves. The first half secretes the sweat, and the second half reabsorbs the sodium and the chloride, which is the salt in the sweat, back into the blood. So what's eliminated as sweat normally is a fluid that has very little salt in it. But in cystic fibrosis, the chloride cannot get back in. And so the salt is not, it can't be reabsorbed. So the salt is not reabsorbed, and it produces a fluid that has a high concentration of salt. And in the worst conditions, the salt in the sweat is approximately the same as that in the blood, because that's where it comes from initially. So then the question is, okay, well, how do you figure out what's going on there? And at the time, there were a few guys that were working on kidneys, and I was in the Department of Nephrology at UCLA. And so I managed to visit one of these guys in Kansas City. His name was Jared Grantham, and he was perfusing tubules from the kidney. So they would take a kidney and pull out the little nephrons and then hook them up to micro pipettes so that you could squirt fluid through them and collect the fluid. Or if you were interested in something else, maybe you could do it electrically. I was trying to do my work by measuring the salt concentrations coming out in individual sweat glands. And an individual sweat gland doesn't produce very much sweat. It's just a few microliters or really nanoliters. So that meant that I had to use nanotechnique. And at the time, there was a new technique called electron X-ray microanalysis. And so there was a guy at Harvard that was perfecting this. So I visited him, and he showed me what was going. And we developed that technique, and we're using it, but we weren't getting anywhere because there's only so much you could do. And I was trying to perfuse it and collect the samples and then analyze to see how much salt was in there and that sort of thing. So I went to an international meeting in Brussels in Belgium. I believe it was Brussels. Maybe it was Liège. Anyway, there was a guy named, oh God, I can see him, but I can't think of his name right off. He was looking at my poster, and he said, "You got to do this electrically. You can find out a lot more if you do it with electrically." And I wasn't an electrophysiologist at all, but what he said, Maurice Berg. See what I told you about memory? Maurice Berg, he was working at the NIH, a great guy. And anyway, he told me that to do it electrically. So I went back and I started studying how to do electrophysiology and hook up the electrodes and connect them to the perfusion pipettes and that sort of thing. The reason to do that is because you can see what's going on with respect to the movement of ions in a fluid when it comes in contact with an epithelium on the basis of the amount of separation of charge that you get. Now, what do I mean by separation of charge? When you separate a positive ion from a negative ion, that's a separation of charge, and it creates a voltage, a difference in potential. And so when sweat comes through the sweat duct, there is a machine, an active transport machine, that absorbs the sodium. Now, the salt is coming as sodium ions, which are positive, and chloride ions, which are negative, and they're completely independent. But they always have to travel together. So if you take two of them too far apart, you create lightning, and you got a big problem. So, but that doesn't happen. You got to be really strong to do that. But anyway, as these two species come down the sweat duct, the pump or the machine that picks up the salt only transports the sodium ion. So it picks up the sodium ion out of the fluid, out of the lumen, and kicks it over and puts it back in the blood where it came from. It leaves the water behind because the membrane is water impermeable. So it picks up the sodium, and then when it does that, it separates the charge. Now, chloride doesn't like to stay there by itself, so it tries to find a way to get to the sodium. And the epithelium is very permeable to the chloride. because there's lots of CFTR. And CFTR is the molecule that makes a little door for the chloride to come through the epithelial cell from the lumen, from the fluid on the surface, back into the blood where it can be happily join the sodium ion. So, I used to draw little cartoons of a male sodium ion with his girlfriend, a chloride ion. So they always like to be together.
I would like to see that drawing.
Okay. Anyway, yeah, I'll send you a copy of that.
When you worked it all out, were you like jumping up and down and screaming? Did you realize what you had discovered?
Well, it's kind of embarrassing. Yeah, I knew what to expect. I mean, at the time, there was a theory that the mucus was too thick in the lung because there was an active transport of salt out of the lung back into the blood, and that took water with it. So by taking the fluid away from the mucus that was in the airways, it would become thick and sticky and clog things up. But that premise was based on the idea, the concept that it was a hyper absorption of the salt, that there was too much salt being absorbed. And I couldn't agree with that. I couldn't buy that because I knew in the sweat gland, it wasn't hyper absorption, it was hypoabsorption. That is too little absorption. So there had to be something that was blocking the ability of the salt to come across. So the idea was that, well, if it's active sodium transport, there must be something blocking the transport or the absorption of chloride. And if that were the case, then the potential, that is the voltage, the separation of charge would be much higher in the cystic fibrosis tissue than it is in the normal tissue. So I, started dissecting sweat glands and learning how to perfuse them and then to measure the potential. And we got to the point where I could measure the potential and do it relatively securely, believe what the numbers that I was getting. And so I did a few normals, and the numbers came out relatively low. I mean, not terribly low for an epithelium, but they were, on the order of 10 millivolts or so, or say maybe a little more than that. So then I decided to do a CF. Well, the closest CF patient to get the tissue from was me. So I did a few biopsies on my thighs, and he got some tissue, and I had a dermatologist do my arms a couple of times. Took out the glands, and when I did the first one, I got it hooked up, and lo and behold, the potential, the separation of charge was dramatically higher in the CF duct. It was instead of 10 millivolts, it was about 60 to 70 millivolts. So that's really, I mean, I didn't expect it to be anything nearly that high. I had to change the meter, the scale on my meter 3 times before it leveled out. And yes, I really did yell Eureka. It's crazy. It still embarrasses me to say that, but it's true. I did.
I imagine you must have just been thrilled. Like this was earth.
Well, it was. It was. No, I like to give this line too, because human beings are unique animals in that they get the greatest delight from discovery. I mean, one of our greatest pleasures is to find something out, to discover it, And if you see something you think nobody else has seen before, that's really something. But, to illustrate that, you just watch a little 2-year-old kid or a 3-year-old kid as they go around. Oh, when they find something new, they are just jumping with joy, and they're into everything because they love to discover things.
You changed the face of cystic fibrosis. My girls are living longer thanks to you.
Yeah, but you have to say the people that developed the modulators really deserve a lot of credit. Yes, they did use this basic defect to screen for those, 500,000 compounds to find a few that would correct this thing. That's what got us to where we are. But that took a lot of work. There were people that were really dedicated to that. And
absolutely. I applaud them all. I'm just trying to give you a little credit, which you deserve. But absolutely, everyone who's been a part of this CF journey, we thank them. But I just think what you did from the start was a building block for everything.
Well, in a way, I think, well, that had something to do with it because until that point, everybody who talked about cystic fibrosis only talked about a defect in the mucus. Either the mucus was being synthesized wrong, or there was too much calcium, or there was too much absorption of salt or something. But it was mucoviscidosis, thick, sticky mucus, and that was the disease. But when we showed that it had a basic defect in electrolyte transport, then that gave us a completely new view, a different direction to look, and we can pursue that. And so once we had that down, then guys like Jack Reardon and his colleagues were able to identify CFTR and isolate it and get the protein by itself so that we could see what was wrong with it. And they identified the basic defect, the mutation, that most common mutation in CF that causes the disease. And so once we knew that, then the people that model molecules could play with it and decide what kind of compounds would change it and correct it and promote it so that we could give drugs that would help people. And so we've had the great fortune to live through that era, that period where, people really did things that really made a difference.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah. And before we wrap up, I just want to hear something personal about your life. Like, is your favorite thing to do? Do you like reading? Like, what's in retirement now? Like, what do you enjoy? Obviously, we're still in the midst of the pandemic, but as serious of the work that you've done, like, what kind of things do you like to do on the lighter side of your life?
Okay, well, I don't know if my muse is still alive, but I like to try to write a poem every now and then. And I'm a little bit given to coming up with aphorisms. And so I sent you a couple of books that are examples of that. And I've really been handicapped by the COVID thing because I love to travel. And I used to go to Argentina about 2 or 3 times a year to ride horses. And we have a little place down there that we have some horses and cows, and I get to be what I call a wannabe cowboy. When I was a kid, I had a horse and I raised a calf and some pigs and stuff like that. So that never really got out of my blood. And I really enjoy that. But, since this COVID thing, I haven't been able to go anywhere. And that's neither as much of anybody else. So I think we're hurting here, but I'm really eager for us to open up again so that we can, get back to the good old days.
Absolutely. I'm ready to travel.
Yeah.
As soon as this ends, oh my gosh, and go see my daughter in England. But I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to talk to us about everything CF and other things related to it. So thank you very much for taking time to be part of the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast.
Good. I'm very glad to contribute a little bit if I can. And, I'd like to say that people shouldn't be pessimistic. It's a time for continued optimism, and cystic fibrosis is not the devastating thing that it used to be. So, yeah, keep smiling.
A great way to end. Thank you, Dr. Paul Quinton.
The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen.
It's not complicated.
Who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know it's got you frustrating, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, check them out online at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical, the science of possibility, and produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts,